Well, thank you very much indeed, Charles, for that very nice plug for my book. And thank you for restarting your subscription to the FT. Heavens knows that the journalists need all the subscriptions we can get in all corners of the media, I think. Now, the title for today's lunch, I see, is Are America's Economic Policy Sustainable? And Peter Peterson has already touched on a number of hard macroeconomic issues that America faces. I'm going to take a slightly different tack and talk a bit about the cultural picture, and in particular the cultural background to what's happened in finance and where the financial system is going. Because as Charles mentioned, I come to this issue from a slightly unusual perspective. Aside from my day job at the FT running the global markets coverage, I trained initially as a social anthropologist and worked in academia for a while. And my career has really been devoted to trying to set financial issues into a cultural perspective. Now, 3 years ago, when I went around Wall Street or the City of London and told people that I had a background in social anthropology, I used to get quite a lot of scorn and bafflement, because 3 years ago, the type of degrees that counted for things in finance were effectively MBAs, economics, physics. A background studying Tajik wedding rituals was not an obvious basis for looking at CDOs or for looking at the tribes of Wall Street. But I don't feel quite so apologetic these days because although bankers have operated in recent years with the illusion that the credit world, was all about Greek letters and complicated mathematical formulae and computer models, as anyone who has a classical education will know, the word credit takes its roots from credere in Latin, which means to believe, which is fundamentally a social construct. Finance is not just about numbers, it's about society too. And without faith, there can be no finance, as we have discovered in the last couple of years to our cost. Now, the issue of faith in finance and what's been underpinning faith in 21st century finance has been of great fascination to me, because I first crashed into the world of credit markets and the modern world of slicing and dicing debt about 5 years ago. My previous job was I was running the Lex column on the FT briefly, which is the bit on the back page of the first section that analyses economic and business issues. And while I was on Lex, I noticed that there were some extraordinary things happening in the world of credit, which were going largely unreported. I used to often say back then that the financial system was a bit like an iceberg, in that there was commoditized coverage of things like the equity markets and almost no coverage at all in much of the mainstream media of the debt and derivatives world. That was a bit bobbing beneath the surface. So I moved across to run the capital markets team and set about trying to make sense of it, a bit like an anthropologist would in the mountains of Tajikistan. And three things struck me almost immediately as fascinating. One was that there was the most remarkable revolution going on in the financial system. As most of you in the room will know, we'd moved from a world where banking was conducted in the old-fashioned way, collecting in money from depositors and lending it out and keeping the loans on the books, to a world where credit risk was being sliced and diced in ever more complicated ways and scattered all over the globe. So the scale of the revolution was remarkable. But what was even more remarkable was that it was almost entirely ignored. As I said, for much of the time, the financial system was like an iceberg. And most remarkable of all was just how few people actually seemed to understand the implications of what was going on, or even understand how it actually operated or fitted together. I sometimes used to feel as if the economy was akin to a giant plane, where all the passengers were sitting on board the plane, and there was only one person on board who knew where the controls were, let alone knew how to fly it. Or another image I sometimes used was, it was a bit like a medieval church, where you had a few high priests next to the altar who spoke financial Latin. Those were the bankers, if you like, only not quite so holy. And then you had the rest of the congregation, which was pretty much everyone else, politicians, consumers, journalists, regulators often, who were sitting dumbly in the congregation without the foggiest idea of what was being said in that financial Latin, or without the foggiest idea of how the system worked. They weren't allowed to approach the altar. I was very struck in the spring of 2007, and I told the story last night, so apologies to those of you who were at the dinner last night. I was very struck by the fact that I was called in to go and see some senior bankers, a senior banker who was very upset with the way that we were writing about structured credit. And he said to me, "Why do you keep writing that structured credit is so opaque, or this business of slicing and dicing debt is so hard to understand? It's not hard to understand. Anyone can understand it if they just look at the right page on a Bloomberg machine." And I said, "Well, that's great, but what about the 99.9% of the population that doesn't have a Bloomberg machine? What are they supposed to do?" And there was a kind of 10-second pause, and I could almost feel him thinking, "You mean there are people out there who don't have Bloomberg, and we should care about them?" There was a sense that basically banking was run by bankers in a small elite, and they alone spoke financial Latin. And in retrospect, it seems absolutely amazing that this situation continued for so long. There is, for those of you who have studied behavioral finance, there is this kind of Akerlof-Lemons theory, which suggests that when investors don't understand something, they should shy away from it, or at least demand a premium if they venture into that territory, which would imply that, in fact, investors should have shied away from much of the structured credit world in recent years. But on the contrary, they rushed in lemming-like and kept gobbling it up, even though they didn't understand it. The congregation sat there, happy to tolerate the status quo, where just the financial priest spoke Latin. And if you ask why that situation was allowed to continue, it was partly because, guess what, everyone was getting rich off the back of it, or almost everyone felt as if they were getting rich at the time. There's that old famous adage, which is that it's almost impossible to make a man understand if his salary depends on not understanding. And plenty of people's salaries a few years ago depended on not understanding or not asking too many questions. But more practically, there were three pillars of faith that were propping up the way that 21st century finance operated, which were crucial to maintaining activity and ensuring that people continued to participate even when they didn't understand. Now, one of those pillars of faith was the ratings agencies, or were the rating agencies, who provided investors with what seemed to be a very nice, simple compass to help them guide their way through this complex maze. People may not actually understand how the slicing and dicing actually worked. People didn't know what a Gaussian copula was, but they could recognize the words AAA on the page. It was wonderfully clear. It also appeared to have what might be called an effect heuristic, a sort of gut instinct reaction in people. I've long had a theory that the reason why AAA was so reassuring was because anyone who's been at college always wanted to become a straight-A student, and the only thing better than being a straight-A student was being a AAA student or buying a AAA product. But there was quite a subtle cultural aspect there. So people used the rating agencies as a guide, the pillar of faith. A second pillar of faith were the banks and the bankers themselves. America was founded on this idea that if you are smart, you will become rich. And I think that often becomes confused culturally with the idea that if you're rich, you must be smart. And because bankers, or it used to do anyway, and since bankers were earning these fat salaries, and because they were in possession of these wonderfully complex models that appeared to give such certainty to this world of finance, it looked as if they knew where the controls were to the plane and knew how to fly them. People put their faith in that as well. And then, of course, it looked as if the entire endeavour, the entire innovation boom in finance had been blessed by the regulators and the authorities. People like Alan Greenspan had told us all that innovation was a good thing because slicing and dicing credit risk had made the system much safer than in the past. And even if ordinary investors or ordinary mortals didn't quite understand how that was supposed to make the system safer in reality, there was a feeling that, hey, the Vatican had blessed the priests, and therefore the congregation was okay to sit there and just receive the blessings.